Americans are paying more at the pump every single day. Gas prices are spiking, oil inventories are shrinking, and millions of barrels of American crude are being loaded onto tankers and shipped overseas. Right now, today, as you watch this. The question tearing apart Washington is brutally simple. If we have enough oil to export it, why aren't we keeping it here? Why are Americans getting squeezed while foreign nations buy our energy? Some lawmakers say the answer is obvious. Ban the exports, keep the oil, slash the prices, done. The Trump administration says that option is off the table. But here is what they are not telling you. Some of the most respected energy analysts in the country, people who have sat inside the White House during energy crises, are quietly calculating a 35% probability that this administration does exactly what it says it will not do. That is a 1 in 3 chance of the most consequential energy policy reversal in a decade. And the consequences, according to those same experts, could be catastrophic, not just for the US economy, but for every nation on Earth that depends on American oil. This story is not just about gas prices. It is about a decision being made right now, in real time, that could determine whether the global economy enters a recession. It could decide whether America's allies in Europe and Asia are thrown into an energy emergency. It could trigger a brand new trade war. And it could permanently destroy something the United States spent decades building, its reputation as the world's most reliable energy supplier. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what a US oil export ban would do, and why experts who spent their entire careers opposing such measures are now, reluctantly, reconsidering. You will understand the hidden political calculus driving this decision, and you will understand what happens next. The 3 scenarios that will determine which direction this goes. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. Now let's get into it. As of today, May 6, 2026, the United States is exporting oil at all-time record highs. This is not normal. This is not routine. This is happening in the middle of the worst energy supply shock in modern history. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows, has been effectively closed by the war in the Middle East. Nearly 1 billion barrels of crude that would normally flow from the Persian Gulf to global markets are trapped, frozen, inaccessible. Europe is scrambling, Asia is scrambling, and they have all turned to the same alternative supplier, the United States of America. U.S. oil exports have responded exactly as a market would expect. Demand from overseas soared. American crude flooded into that gap. Exports hit an all-time peak in late April. Meanwhile, U.S. energy inventories, the domestic reserves that act as a buffer against price shocks, have been shrinking rapidly every single week. Federal data released this week confirms the drawdown continued last week. And at the gas station, Americans are feeling it. Prices are up sharply. They are not coming down. And the political pressure on the White House is becoming impossible to ignore. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna has already reintroduced legislation, the Gasoline Export Ban Act, that would prohibit the export of gasoline during periods of high domestic prices. His argument, delivered to Fox Business last month, was blunt. Americans are being fleeced at the pump, he said, while their own country's oil is shipped abroad. The Trump administration says it will not restrict exports. Energy Secretary Wright and Interior Secretary Burgum have made that promise publicly and privately to industry. But behind closed doors, the calculation is shifting. And the question now is not whether pressure to act is building. It is whether this administration can hold that line when the midterms are on the horizon and gas prices keep going up. To understand why this debate is so explosive, you need to understand a history most Americans have forgotten. The United States banned crude oil exports for 40 years. After the Arab oil embargo of 1973, when OPEC nations cut off oil supplies to the U.S. in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Congress enacted sweeping restrictions on oil exports. The goal was energy security. Keep the oil at home, never be held hostage again. For nearly 4 decades, that ban held. The U.S. hoarded its crude. Domestic production stagnated. America became increasingly dependent on foreign oil, exactly the opposite of what the ban intended to achieve. Everything changed in 2015. The shale revolution had unlocked staggering reserves in Texas, New Mexico, North Dakota, and beyond. American oil production had surged to levels no one thought possible a decade earlier. The country was now producing more than it needed. The 40-year ban was lifted under the Obama administration in December 2015. The transformation was immediate and profound. Within years, the United States became the world's largest oil producer, then the world's largest oil exporter. American crude began flowing to Europe, Asia, Latin America, building trade relationships, energy partnerships, and geopolitical influence. This was not just economics, it was strategy. American energy exports became a diplomatic tool, a lever, a way to tell allies, you do not need to depend on Russia. You do not need to depend on the Gulf. You can count on us. That credibility, built over a decade, is now on the line. Because when a government bans exports, it sends a message. The message is, when things get hard, we put ourselves first. We are not a reliable partner. We cannot be counted on. Once that message is sent, it cannot be unsent. We told you at the start of this video that the people closest to this decision, former White House energy advisors, are putting a 35% probability on export restrictions happening. Here's what we now know about why that number is not as reassuring as it sounds, and it is worse than most people realize. This story has players on every side, and understanding their positions explains exactly where this is heading. Start with President Donald Trump. He ran on energy dominance. Drill, baby, drill was not just a slogan, it was the centerpiece of his economic agenda. An oil export ban would be a direct reversal of everything he campaigned on. It would be an admission that market forces are not working, that government intervention is necessary, that his approach has failed. For a president who loathes admissions of failure, this is an enormous psychological and political barrier. And yet, the midterms are approaching. Gas prices are a voting issue, always have been. When prices spike, presidents pay at the ballot box. Energy Secretary Chris Wright and Interior Secretary Doug Burgum are the public face of the administration's resistance to export restrictions. Both men have deep ties to the energy industry. Both understand what a ban would do to domestic producers and refiners. They are, for now, holding the line. Then there is Congressman Ro Khanna, Democrat, Silicon Valley, unusual ally for populist energy politics. Khanna's Gasoline Export Ban Act is gaining attention precisely because it frames the issue in terms any voter can understand. Why is our oil going overseas when we are paying this at home? On the industry side, Chevron CEO Mike Wirth has already gone public with his opposition. Speaking at the Milken Institute's global conference this week, Wirth warned that export bans and price caps might be well-intentioned, but history proves they create consequences worse than the problem they were designed to solve. Bob McNally is the crucial voice here, president of Rapidan Energy Group, former energy policy advisor to President George W. Bush, a man who has sat in the room when these decisions get made. He knows the pressure. He is the one who gave the 35% estimate, and his warning carries enormous weight. He has watched administrations say they will not do something, and then do it anyway when the political walls close in. Let's talk about what is actually happening right now for real people. Because this is not an abstract policy debate. It is being felt at every gas station in America. U.S. oil exports hit record highs in late April. That means American oil is leaving the country at the fastest rate in history, at the exact moment American families are struggling to afford a full tank. The cruelty of that image is not lost on voters, and politicians know it. But here is what most people do not understand about how American energy actually works. The United States imports 6.5 million barrels of crude oil every single day, even while being a net exporter. Read that again. 6.5 million barrels per day coming in. Why? Because American refineries, most of them aging, most of them built for a different era, cannot run on American shale oil alone. The light, sweet crude pumped out of the Permian Basin in West Texas is exceptional for some products, but American refiners need to blend it with heavier crude from Canada, Latin America, and historically the Middle East to produce the mix of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel that the country actually consumes. The American oil the refiners do not need gets exported. The heavy crude they do need gets imported. This is not inefficiency. This is how the system was built. And if you ban exports without addressing imports, Without restructuring the entire supply chain, you do not fix anything, you break everything. Energy inventories, which serve as the cushion between supply disruption and crisis, have been falling rapidly every week. That shrinking buffer means the margin for error is getting smaller. The day the buffer runs out, prices do not just rise, they spike violently. Meanwhile, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has removed the backup supply that would normally fill that buffer. The United States is not just supplying its own market, it is supplying the world. And that dual pressure, domestic demand and global panic, is what is draining those inventories week after week. But here's the part no one is talking about, and it changes everything. The experts who are most opposed to an export ban, the ones who built their careers arguing against government intervention in energy markets, are now the same ones calculating the odds that it happens anyway. When the people who hate an idea most are assigning it a 1 in 3 chance, you need to pay attention. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe. We are just getting to the most important part. The United States does not make this decision in a vacuum. The global energy market is watching every signal coming out of Washington, and so are America's allies. Europe is in a precarious position. Since the Strait of Hormuz closure trapped Gulf crude, European nations have been desperately rerouting their energy supply chains. American oil has filled a critical portion of that gap. If the US restricts exports now, even temporarily, the hole in the European energy supply does not close. It widens. Asian nations face a similar calculus. Japan, South Korea, India, all of them have been increasing purchases of US crude as Middle Eastern supply evaporated. A US export ban would force them back into a market where there is no ready alternative. Global prices would spike in ways that make today's numbers look manageable. China has already moved. In the weeks following the Strait of Hormuz closure, Beijing quietly suspended its own oil exports. China made a national decision. Its oil stays inside China. Washington has not widely publicized this fact, but it sets a precedent. Other major producers watching China act could feel emboldened to do the same. The International Energy Agency has been monitoring the situation closely, urging member nations to release strategic reserves and resist the temptation to impose export restrictions, precisely because those restrictions, applied simultaneously by multiple countries, could transform a regional energy crisis into a global catastrophe. And from the diplomatic corridor, America's allies are watching the export ban debate with barely concealed alarm. These are nations that have been told, repeatedly for a decade, that American energy is reliable, that they can build supply chains around it, that the era of energy dependence on authoritarian producers is over. A ban would prove them wrong. Here is what mainstream media coverage is almost entirely missing about this story. The export ban debate is happening at the worst possible moment for American refiners, and a ban would not just hurt them, it could permanently close some of them. Robert Hours, the refined fuels manager at RBN Energy, made this point with startling clarity. A ban might bring gas prices down next week. In the short run, it works. But over the course of a year, as refiners lose access to the heavier foreign crude they need to blend with American shale oil, they cut production. Margins collapse. Some refiners, already operating on thin margins in an industry that has not seen significant new construction in decades, go out of business permanently. Once a refinery closes, it does not reopen. The capital investment required is enormous. The regulatory process takes years. When a refinery shuts down, that refining capacity is gone. And here is the compounding problem. The United States has been losing refining capacity for years. At its peak in the early 1980s, America had over 300 operating refineries. Today, that number has fallen to fewer than 130. Every closure makes the remaining system more fragile, more exposed, more vulnerable to exactly the kind of shock the country is experiencing right now. A ban that closes even a handful of additional refineries does not just hurt consumers next year, it structurally weakens American energy independence for the next generation. This is the real hidden cost, the one that does not make the political speech, the one that gets buried under the talking point about lower gas prices next month. The policy that looks like a rescue today could be the sabotage that cripples American energy for the next 20 years. Remember the question at the heart of this story? Will they do it, despite saying they will not? Here is what we now know. The political math is moving. Gas prices are not going down. The midterms are getting closer, and the people inside the system say the walls are closing in. What happens next could be the most consequential energy decision in a decade. Let us be precise about what is actually at risk here, because the stakes operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and each one compounds the others. At the consumer level, a short-term export ban could temporarily reduce gas prices. That is the honest assessment, even from analysts who oppose the idea. The question is not whether it provides short-term relief. It does. The question is what it destroys in order to deliver that relief. At the refinery level, the cascading effects described by multiple energy experts suggest that within months, reduced throughput, margin compression, and supply chain disruption begin reversing the price gains. A year out, prices may be no different than they would have been without the ban, but the refining industry is permanently weakened. At the diplomatic level, the United States has spent 10 years repositioning itself as the world's dependable energy partner. European nations built policy around that reliability. Asian nations signed long-term contracts based on it. A unilateral export restriction, especially during a global crisis, signals that American energy reliability has limits. That signal, once sent, reshapes global energy architecture. Nations that shifted away from Russian and Gulf suppliers to American ones will begin hedging their bets. They will diversify. And American energy influence, a genuine geopolitical asset, diminishes. At the trade level, ours and other analysts predict severe retaliation, tariff actions, counter-restrictions, a cascade of trade hostilities that makes last year's tariff war look like a skirmish. And at the macro level, Vikas Dwivedi of Macquarie Group stated it plainly. Global energy prices would go, in his words, crazy high. A global recession becomes a real possibility, and the United States, despite trying to insulate itself, cannot escape the blowback of a global recession it helped trigger. The worst case is not just economic pain. It is a world where a policy designed to help American consumers accelerates exactly the crisis it was meant to prevent. Let us sit with what the analysts are actually saying, because the expert consensus on this issue is both clearer and more alarming than most coverage suggests. Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy is the most quoted voice in this story, and for good reason. He has been in the room. He has watched presidents make energy decisions under pressure, and his assessment is not ideological, it is behavioral. He says a ban is a terrible idea. He says it will not achieve its goals, and he says there is a 35% chance this administration does it anyway. Because when prices keep rising and the midterms loom, bad ideas become very tempting. Vikas Dwivedi of Macquarie Group represents perhaps the most striking voice. He has spent his entire career arguing against export restrictions, and he is now saying, publicly, on the record, that a temporary ban might actually crash U.S. energy prices fast enough to provide meaningful consumer relief before it falls apart. He used 4 words that tell you everything about how severe this crisis is. He said, "I cannot believe I am saying this." When a career-long opponent of a policy starts conceding it might be considered, the situation has become genuinely extraordinary. Matt Smith at Kepler grounds the analysis in the supply chain reality. The U.S. imports 6.5 million barrels per day. That fact alone explains why a simple export ban does not solve a simple problem. The system is interdependent. It was designed to be interdependent. Breaking one part to fix another part does not fix the whole. It breaks more of it. Chevron CEO Mike Wirth represents the industry's position with the authority of someone running one of the world's largest energy companies. His message is consistent with what economists and policy analysts have said for decades. Price controls and export restrictions create unintended consequences. History proves it, and history does not make exceptions for political urgency. The expert consensus is not that export restrictions are impossible. It is that they are dangerous, difficult to reverse, and almost certain to cause damage that outlasts any short-term relief they provide. We started this video with a simple question. Will the Trump administration ban oil exports to slash gas prices, despite saying it will not? Here is what we now know. The public denial and the private probability estimates are pointing in 2 completely different directions, and the window in which this decision gets made is narrowing by the week. 3 scenarios. Here is where this goes from here. Best case, the Strait of Hormuz situation stabilizes faster than expected. Some diplomatic channel opens. Middle Eastern oil begins flowing again. Global supply pressure eases. U.S. export demand moderates. Domestic inventories stop falling. Gas prices peak and begin a slow decline. The White House holds its line on exports. The export ban debate fades until the next crisis. Likely case. The Strait of Hormuz closure continues through the summer. U.S. inventories keep shrinking. Gas prices breach levels that become genuinely damaging for household budgets. The White House, under midterm pressure, begins floating targeted or temporary restrictions rather than an outright ban, a middle path designed to provide political cover while claiming it is not really an export ban. Industry fights it. Allies protest. But it happens in some form. Prices drop briefly. Refiners adjust painfully. The damage is real, but contained. America's energy reputation takes a measurable hit. Worst case, a full petroleum export restriction is imposed in response to a price spike that triggers genuine public outrage. Global markets react immediately. Energy prices outside the U.S. surge. Allies scramble. Retaliation follows. Tariffs, counter-restrictions. Some U.S. refineries, unable to sustain operations under the new constraints, begin curtailing production. Within 6 to 12 months, domestic gas prices have returned to where they were, or higher, but the global economic damage is done. The trade war escalates. A recession is underway, and the U.S. energy sector has been structurally damaged in ways that will take years to repair. The trajectory currently points toward the likely case, but the window between likely and worst is narrower than most people realize. Here is what we want to know from you, and this is a genuinely hard question with no easy answer. If you were sitting in the Oval Office tomorrow, with gas prices rising every week and the midterms on the calendar, would you impose some form of oil export restriction, even knowing the long-term consequences? Or do you hold the line, absorb the political damage, and protect the global architecture that American energy built over the past decade? And second, do you believe the Trump administration's public reassurances that export restrictions are off the table? Or do you think the 35% probability estimate is actually too low? Tell us what you think in the comments. This is exactly the kind of debate that matters. 3 things to take away from everything you just heard. First, the United States is exporting oil at record levels during a domestic energy crisis, and the political pressure to change that is real, bipartisan, and growing. Second, the experts who understand this system best, including people who have sat in the White House during energy emergencies, are not saying an export ban is impossible. They are saying it is a 1 in 3 probability. That is not a fringe scenario. That is a live risk. Third, if it happens, the consequences extend far beyond the gas station. They touch every nation that relies on American energy, every trade relationship the U.S. has built, and the long-term structural health of American refining capacity. Watch 3 things in the coming days. Watch the weekly inventory data from the Energy Information Administration. If the drawdown accelerates, the pressure intensifies. Watch for any shift in language from Energy Secretary Wright. And watch global oil prices, because if they keep rising, the domestic political calculation changes fast. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change everything. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. America built something remarkable over the past decade. The question now is whether a single energy crisis, and the politics that come with it, will be the moment it throws that away.